and it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathan Van Tam. He doesn't really need an introduction, does he, over the last 18 months. The thing I remember about Jonathan is all his analogies, the train moving into the station, A1, driving down the A1, or pitching up a tent in a blowing gale. All related to vaccines and so on. So, those are really good. So I really want to thank Jonathan for coming to do this talk today. Jonathan's got a busy day. He's got to rush up to Liverpool, to the other College of Physicians, to do the Havaian oration in Liverpool this evening. So, but Jonathan, kindly accepted to come and do this in person, and then he's rushing off on the train up to Liverpool. So thank you very much, Jonathan. We look forward to your talk.
Thanks, Sir Munir, distinguished guests, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation today. And thank you, Munir, for reminding me about my analogies. The train one in particular led to kind of notoriety and fame in equal measure within the railway industry, and I ended up at the National Rail Awards at the Grosvenor, giving out all the prizes recently. So there you are. I think that was the most unexpected bit of the pandemic for me. So what I'm going to do in the next 25 minutes or so is just present to you some, I think, what I call overview reflections on the journey we've been through together in the last 2 years, and my perspectives on some of the kind of big things inside that space. So, I'm learning. This is the first time I've used one of these in 2 years. So in terms of the epidemiology of cases, you can see here very well described on the slide in terms of absolute numbers, the three waves of this pandemic that we have been through together. And conspicuous is the size of the first wave, which of course in statistical terms was very small, but in real epidemiological terms I suspect was close to as large as the second. The difference here is that there was simply around the world insufficient diagnostics in every country on the planet, and diagnostics had to be targeted to the people who were primarily those presenting with severe respiratory illness, in other words, presenting in hospital. So, of course, until you have this kind of very widespread availability of and access to diagnostics, you're going to be in a difficult position in terms of information, and also your data are going to look like this. And I think the next slide kind of proves the theory that testing was indeed of necessity targeted in the hospitals, again towards patients with severe illness. And you can see reflected here the waves of hospitalizations. And here the notable point is that the third and current ongoing wave is quite a magnitude different to the first two, and I'm sure we all know the reasons why. And that is reflected again in the epidemiology that we've observed over deaths attributable to COVID in the UK's case within 28 days of a positive diagnosis. And you can see again this diminution in mortality associated with the third wave, which is of course associated with the really quite astonishing progress that we made in terms of delivering the first doses of vaccine from December 2020 until the present day, and the follow-on 12 weeks later in terms of receiving the second dose. Now, some of the more interesting data that are now starting to emerge include these data, and these are all age data, and they're a comparison of autumn this year versus autumn last year. And last year is 2020, it's the paler blue curves. So what you can see, that as far as these curves go, in terms of cases and numbers, we are at this current point in our autumn running hotter earlier than we were in 2020. And if you look at these kind of peaks, they are quite similar. If, on the other hand, you look at hospital admissions, you can see that although in this kind of late summer, early autumn period, we are running hotter on admissions than we were at the same time in 2020, we aren't at the moment seeing the return to these really quite awful levels of admission that we saw back in the winter of last year. And it's the same for patients in hospital, which is obviously a different metric on a different scale. Rather than new admissions here, we're talking about patients admitted and still in hospital with COVID. And the mortality figures, again, show that we are in a very different place. And this disaggregation is, I'm sure, attributed to the effects of the vaccine. Let's dive into those data a little more deeply and look first of all at the over 65s, where, remember, these people were, this was a part of our population vaccinated first. And you can see actually the peak is lower than the autumn peak, and generally, although still starting from a higher place, these levels of illness are more comparable. The picture from admissions is very much more encouraging, and the picture in terms of mortality is again very much more encouraging. It isn't quite the same in the under 65s, where one can see that we have run very hot very early, and I attribute much of this to the fact that, of necessity, the rollout of the UK vaccine programme began later in adults of younger age and later again in children. The admissions, again, are more encouraging than last year on this downward slope to the point where the data end. They have turned a bit since then, but they're not, the differences are less pronounced than in the over 65s, and this again with mortality. So putting all of that together, if you look at some of the PHE work on observed and expected hospitalizations in patients aged 65 and over, the green curve is the expected data, and you can see there's a reasonably good fit with the observed data, the red data, in the early part of 2021. And of course the observed, the expected is expected in the absence of vaccination. And what you can see is this very clear divergence here between what we might have expected based on case rates versus where we've actually observed in terms of hospitalizations. And the kind of final figures on this are that probably versus no vaccination in the UK, the PHE estimates suggest that we've probably averted somewhere between 23 and 24 million cases of COVID in this country through vaccination. We have probably averted around 230,000 hospitalizations, and we have probably averted between 120 and 130,000 additional deaths that would otherwise have occurred without the vaccine. So, you know, what a fantastic success this has been. In terms of where we were on vaccine effectiveness and where we are now, if you look to the right of the chart first, these are the early vaccine effectiveness data for Pfizer and for Oxford AstraZeneca versus a range of outcomes, and arrayed against the alpha variant, which was dominant at the turn of this year. And you can see those figures are pretty impressive, but you can see now some degradation in terms of where we have landed in terms of the Delta variant, where vaccine effectiveness, there has been some diminution as the virus has changed. But generally speaking, things so far have held up very well, and that is very encouraging. The uptake data tell an interesting story, and these data are UK data, but they are really no different from any of the data that you would see anywhere around the world, where in the elderly, with an efficient program, you can see very, very rapid adoption of vaccine in just a very short period of weeks from the start of the program in the elderly. And this enormous enthusiasm to be vaccinated that perhaps is unprecedented in terms of modern history anywhere in the world. But as you go through the younger age cohorts, you can see that take-up rate decrease. And I'm sure that maybe I'm sure it is multifactorial. I'm sure it will be related to perceptions of risk, perceptions of illness, but it will also relate to busyness and ability to access vaccination services, even though we have made enormous efforts to be kind of extensively inclusive about the offer and the access to vaccines. And you can see that the kind of plateauing in the younger age cohorts is at a different quantum to the plateauing in the older age groups. And really the same is reflected in the dose 2 data, but very rigidly, in a very disciplined way, you can see that the beginning of the kind of upswing in second dose was around about the 12-week mark, which of course reflects the JCVI policy of that priority first dose for as many people as possible with a delayed interval to second dose. Also, and it's difficult to see without me flicking back through the slides, you can see that the kind of top cohorts here are plateauing out at above 90%. If you go back to the previous slide, they're topping up just slightly higher on first dose. So what that really is telling us is that in those critical older age groups, the inability to follow through on second dose is really very slight. And some of it, of course, at those ages will be attributed to failure to survive to the second dose in people who were at the end of their natural life expectancy anyway. If you look at these data, which are week 34 to week 36 this year, on rates of disease by vaccination status, you can see that given that, although these two are equal, given that 90%, 95% of the over 80s are heavily vaccinated, there is a very clear effect of vaccine protection, and it becomes even more intuitive in the data as you move down to the younger age groups. If you look at inpatient admission, that's for at least one night with a COVID diagnosis in the same period, you can see a quite dramatic effect, and you can see where the burden of hospitalisation is now lying in terms of those who remain unvaccinated in our society. And it's a very similar position for deaths. So I'm moving on now to some of the kind of extra things I want to say. The Vaccine Task Force. I have to say that I'm really proud to have been the clinical advisor to the Vaccine Task Force. It has been the most astonishing group of people, the most astonishing entity to ever be involved with. I've never seen such levels of mission focus, camaraderie, agility and determination since the end of my military days. It has really been quite astonishing to see how this group has worked together. The kind of assembly of cross-disciplinary people they brought together, particularly from the bioindustry. And that is really important, and I can't emphasize enough how important it was to think outside of the box and not make this a civil service or public sector official task, but actually to bring in people from the vaccine industry, get them on the inside of the tent and say, how can we change this? How can we do this really fast? And the NIHR has been absolutely pivotal in working with the VTF and getting those clinical trials up and running in the UK. 500,000 people agreed that they would go into vaccine trials very, very quickly. And it took 3 weeks to get 15,000 people into the Novavax trial. It's unprecedented and quite astonishing. Also unprecedented and quite astonishing, and I don't mean to embarrass the next speaker, is the role of the MHRA, who always punched above their weight, in my view, in Europe as a regulator, and have really shown their true ability in this pandemic to be very flexible about regulation of these vaccines whilst maintaining standards, to have stripped out all of the kind of the finery and the decoration that sometimes goes with regulatory submissions, and to focus on what really matters and to be really very, very public health minded in what they've done. I'm also going to kind of call out the JCVI, particularly for their solidarity amongst themselves and their determination that they would stick to the first dose priority 12-week interval rule. This was very widely criticised at the time. It was criticised by the British Medical Association, verbally and vocally in the media. It was criticised by the World Health Organization, and it was criticised more covertly by many other countries. The data are now pretty clear. If you look at Mary Ramsey and Gayatri's publication, the data are very clear that the response to vaccine is definitely heightened for both of the products we used early on if the interval is 12 weeks. So it was absolutely the right thing to do. JCVI have been vindicated, and it shows the kind of courage of their conviction that they stuck to that. The reason for the prioritisation is really very simple, and it's summed up in this one slide, which is a JCVI slide, which illustrates the modelling that went on over the number needed to vaccinate to avert one death. And it's a really very stark hierarchy here of the number needed to vaccinate, and it explains absolutely clearly why the priority was first in care home residents and then dropping down by decade. The NHS has to have huge thanks, and if any of you are involved in the vaccination programme, huge thanks to you. It was an enormous effort. It was very well coordinated. There was real determination to get this going as fast as possible. And I'm kind of unashamed to show you this picture here of me doing my thing. And this lady doesn't mind me telling you her name. It was Joan Dixon. And Joan was 92. She may be 93 now. And she kind of skipped into the room. And she was really very emotional indeed about getting her vaccine. And I was very emotional too about giving it to her. It was a moment in time. So back to something a little more mundane now, but very, very important, research. We had in the UK the most astonishing research infrastructure in place. And if there was ever a point when that infrastructure proved its value, it has been in the last 2 years. We have this really seamless pathway of handover from UK MRI, MRC to NIHR, and it has been really very, very important. We've been able to build very rapidly on that in the UK during the pandemic. The UK Vaccine Network actually funded a MERS vaccine pilot project from Oxford University in 2016, which gave them an enormous head start. We were able to launch a research call a couple of days after the first 2 patients died in the UK due to COVID, and we already, by the time of lockdown, were funding 6 major projects. So it has been an astonishing story. We moved from the start of recovery in early March at the big clinical trial through to 1,000 patients by April, 10,000 by May, and so forth. The focus has been on finding an effective vaccine, treatments, policy, epidemiology, supporting the global response, diagnostics, and most importantly now, or at least as importantly now, there's a big piece of work going on long COVID. And we have to keep going with studies on vaccines so that we understand what we do next in terms of policy. I'm going to skip that slide. It's a test. Good. Except to say to you that you can see the acceleration of patients into clinical trials over the time course of the pandemic from March 20 to March 2021, and we've managed to pull in 1 million patients in that time. Absolutely astonishing efforts. A really big one, and the one where I'm going to kind of end my presentation, is the recovery trial, which recruited on the 19th of March. By the 29th of September this year, there were 43,000 patients in this platform trial. It has given a tick to dexamethasone, tocilizumab, and Regenencov, Ronapreve. It has also, and I think really importantly, thrown out a number of speculative treatments that have now been shown not to hold value for the treatment of patients with acute SARS-CoV-2 infection, and the list is quite a long one. We think that dexamethasone has saved tens of thousands of lives in the UK and several million lives around the world. This is an astonishing tribute to the power of British science in finding solutions for the world. So I'm going to stop there. That was kind of my journey, and I hope some of it will be familiar to many of you. I want to thank you personally. I've heard some stories about people moving away from their normal places of work, people in this lecture theatre, to go and help out on the COVID wards, on the ICUs, and I want to thank all of you for doing that. I know it has not been without personal cost. Thank you.